Thomas Gregory, a respected doctor with a flawless reputation, seemed to have it all: the perfect career, the perfect life, and the perfect wife. Elena Gregory, beautiful and beloved, stood by his side as the picture of grace and warmth. But behind closed doors, their seemingly perfect marriage hid a dark secret. For 2 years, Thomas slowly poisoned the woman he had vowed to cherish, his expertise in medicine becoming the very weapon he used to destroy her. What led this man, once admired by all, to betray his wife in the most horrific way imaginable? Dr. Thomas Gregory was a man many admired. As a renowned physician, his medical expertise made him a well-respected figure in the community. He had spent years building a successful career in the medical field, and his reputation as a caring, competent doctor was impeccable. His wife, Eleanor, was equally admired. She was beautiful, kind-hearted, and intelligent, someone everyone gravitated toward at social events. Together, they were the perfect couple, seemingly the embodiment of success. They had the kind of life people envied, one filled with luxury, achievements, and admiration from all sides. Their home was a spacious, elegant mansion tucked away in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. On weekends, they would host lavish dinner, parties, always surrounded by close friends and colleagues, effortlessly playing the roles of the perfect hosts. The couple's charm and beauty seemed to make them untouchable, and for many, their marriage represented the pinnacle of what a partnership should be: affectionate, successful, and built on mutual respect. But behind the smiles and the glowing public image, things were far more complicated. While Thomas exuded warmth and competence in public, privately, there were cracks forming in his character. Elena, on the other hand, remained cheerful and optimistic, even when faced with her own growing personal struggles. For some time, she had been experiencing strange health issues: persistent stomach aches, fatigue, and occasional dizziness. These symptoms would come and go, but over time, they became more frequent and harder to ignore. Elena initially dismissed her symptoms as nothing more than the result of stress or a busy lifestyle. She often joked about needing to slow down, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Still, she trusted the doctors she saw, and they, too, couldn't find anything concrete. Blood tests came back normal, and various scans showed no signs of anything truly wrong. This only left Elena more confused and frustrated, but she didn't want to burden anyone with her concerns. After all, she was married to a highly respected doctor, a man who surely knew the ins and outs of medicine better than anyone. She assumed Thomas, who was well versed in the field, would be able to help her understand what was happening. However, he seemed to offer only vague explanations, telling her that stress or a busy schedule was likely the cause of her issues. Thomas, however, had a different plan brewing in his mind. While Eleanor's physical condition was slowly deteriorating, he saw an opportunity that would work to his advantage. Beneath his calm exterior, he was growing more resentful, and the thought of a life tied to Elena, her health problems, and the demanding nature of their marriage began to weigh on him. He began to devise a methodical, sinister scheme that would not only rid him of the burden of dealing with Eleanor's mysterious health issues, but also secure a future for himself that had nothing to do with her suffering. He began to notice Eleanor's symptoms more closely, using his medical knowledge to pinpoint just how much her health was declining, while at the same time maintaining a facade of concern. On the surface, Thomas played the role of the supportive husband, but his mind was focused on a much darker goal, a slow, calculated plan to poison Eleanor and eventually take everything for himself. To the outside world, the Gregorys were the perfect couple living the perfect life. But beneath the polished surface, Thomas's resentment festered, setting the stage for a tragedy that would unfold in the coming years. As time passed, Elena's health continued to decline, but the progression was so gradual that it went unnoticed by many. She had been dealing with the same vague symptoms: constant fatigue, stomach discomfort, headaches, and dizziness, but now they seemed to be getting worse. She struggled to keep up with her usual activities. Where she once radiated energy, she now found herself increasingly exhausted, unable to keep up with the demands of her busy social life and household responsibilities. Yet, her outward appearance never gave anyone cause for concern. She still managed to look put together, even when she felt like a shell of herself. At first, Elena attributed her worsening health to the stress of balancing her demanding life as the wife of a successful doctor. She had become accustomed to putting everyone else's needs ahead of her own, but this time it seemed to be catching up with her. Her fatigue was constant, making it harder for her to get through the day. At night, her sleep was disrupted, and she found herself waking up feeling unrefreshed even after hours of rest. What had once been a busy but fulfilling routine now felt like an overwhelming series of tasks that she could barely manage. As she tried to carry on, Elena noticed her weight beginning to drop. It was subtle at first, but over time it became impossible to ignore. She had always been thin, but now her clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her face began to look gaunt. She assumed it was a result of her poor eating habits, long hours at the hospital, social events that left little time for proper meals, and the overwhelming stress of everyday life. She was sure that if she could just slow down, everything would go back to normal. Thomas, however, didn't share Eleanor's optimism. While he feigned concern, he couldn't help but notice how much weaker she was becoming. He watched as the woman he had once known as vibrant and full of life became fragile and worn down. But rather than offering solutions, he continued to hide the truth. Thomas knew that Eleanor's symptoms were not the result of stress or overwork. He knew what was truly happening. He had been carefully and secretly poisoning her for months, and it was beginning to show. The subtlety of his actions was his brilliance. He had chosen a poison that would not be immediately detectable, and one that would mimic the symptoms of an illness that could easily be explained away by any doctor. He had carefully dosed her food with small amounts of the poison, just enough to cause gradual damage to her body. It was a slow, cruel process. Elena's digestive issues worsened, and she found herself spending more time in doctors' offices, undergoing endless tests that always came back normal. She began to doubt herself. Could it be all in her head? Was she just overreacting to normal stress? No one could provide answers, and the lack of a diagnosis only made her feel more isolated. Thomas continued to play the role of the concerned husband. He took her to various specialists, all of whom were baffled by her symptoms. He comforted her in public, all while privately planning her gradual demise. Elena was increasingly disoriented, often forgetting things or becoming confused about simple tasks. Her physical decline was evident to those closest to her, but no one had any answers. The more her health deteriorated, the more Thomas became adept at deflecting suspicion. Elena, now desperate, began to research her symptoms on her own. But with each passing day, the fear of an undiagnosed disease grew stronger. Little did she know, the most significant threat to her life was the very person who had once sworn to protect her. her husband. Still, the slow nature of her illness kept her from seeing the truth, and by the time she realized that something sinister was happening, it was already too late. As Eleanor's condition worsened, the concern of her close friends and family began to grow. Once an energetic woman who could light up a room with her laughter and vibrant personality, she now appeared as a pale, fragile shadow of herself. She struggled to get through daily tasks, her once glowing skin now dull and blotchy. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with vitality, now seemed clouded and tired. Her friends noticed the change first. They could no longer ignore how much weight she had lost, how thin and fragile she had become. Eleanor had always been slender, but now it was as if her body was wasting away before their eyes. It was impossible to overlook the hollowness in her face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the tiredness in her voice. Some of her closest friends tried to confront her, expressing their concerns, but Eleanor was quick to brush it off. She attributed everything to the stress she'd been under, her demanding social calendar, her husband's busy career, and her own attempts to juggle it all. She didn't want to admit that something might be terribly wrong, especially when there were no answers to explain what was happening. Still, the questions lingered in the air, even as she smiled and reassured everyone that she was fine. But inside, Elena was becoming increasingly desperate. She felt trapped in her own body, unable to make sense of what was happening to her. Her headaches became more frequent and severe, and her stomach pains grew more intense, as if something inside her was slowly deteriorating. She began losing track of time, feeling disoriented and confused. On more than one occasion, she forgot what she was doing mid-task or couldn't remember a simple conversation she'd had only hours earlier. The confusion was the most unsettling symptom. Her memory seemed to fail her when she needed it most. It was as though a fog had settled over her mind, and she couldn't quite lift it. Her once organized and active mind was now clouded and sluggish. But through it all, Thomas was by her side, constantly reassuring her that everything was fine. When Elena would ask him about her ongoing symptoms, he would downplay them, offering vague reassurances. "You're just under a lot of stress," he would say, or "It's probably just a passing illness." Despite his words, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening. She had heard of doctors who secretly harmed their patients, but she never imagined it could happen to her. Her suspicions began to creep in as she realized the pattern of her symptoms. They were always worse after meals, and she often felt unusually sick after drinking water or eating certain foods. It was strange, but she couldn't explain it. One day, Eleanor decided to confide in a close friend, asking if they thought something could be wrong with her health. Her friend, noticing just how weak and frail Elena had become, urged her to seek another opinion. They suggested seeing a different doctor who might be able to shed light on the situation. Elena hesitated, not wanting to worry anyone, but deep down she knew it was time to seek answers. But even as she made plans to visit another doctor, she felt a sense of dread creeping over her. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together. She realized that her health had been deteriorating for far too long without anyone being able to pinpoint the cause. The thought struck her like a cold wave. Could Thomas be involved? But the very idea seemed impossible. She trusted him completely, and he had always been the one person she could rely on. But as the days passed, that sense of doubt grew stronger. Still, she didn't have any concrete proof. Nothing could explain the gradual decline in her health, except the gnawing feeling that she was being betrayed in a way she couldn't yet understand. But the longer Elena fought to ignore the signs, the harder it became to deny the possibility that something far darker than illness was at play. The slow-burning realization of what might be happening was enough to send a chill down her spine, even as she struggled to hold on to any shred of hope. One evening, after another long day of doctors' visits and endless tests that yielded no answers, Elena collapsed in her kitchen. Her body simply gave out. She had been feeling more and more faint as the days passed, and this time her exhaustion took a physical toll. Her legs buckled beneath her and she crumpled to the floor. She was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, her body a fragile shell that seemed incapable of handling even the simplest demands of life. At the hospital, doctors initially thought it might be a severe episode of dehydration or a reaction to one of the medications she had been prescribed. But when they conducted more tests, they discovered something far more troubling. There was a rare toxic substance in her system, one that didn't belong there and couldn't be easily explained by any of her diagnoses. The poison was subtle, and it was the kind of thing that could go undetected for a long time unless specifically tested for. The doctors were puzzled, but immediately called in authorities when they realized that something was seriously wrong. They weren't sure if it was a mistake or if Elena had been poisoned, but one thing was clear: her condition was suspicious. As Elena was treated for what they now suspected was poisoning, the investigation into her sudden collapse began. Thomas, ever the composed professional, appeared devastated. He stayed by her side in the hospital, playing the role of the concerned and loving husband. But those closest to him began to notice something unsettling. His outward displays of grief seemed too rehearsed, too perfect to be genuine. He never seemed truly rattled, even when doctors were explaining the gravity of Elena's condition. Instead, he appeared oddly calm, like a man who already knew what had happened. The police started asking questions. They focused on the details of Elena's daily life, who she had interacted with, what she had been eating, and whether anyone could have possibly had access to her food or medications. Thomas was questioned thoroughly, but he maintained his innocence. He claimed that he was just as shocked as anyone by the discovery of the poison, and that he couldn't possibly understand how it had entered her system. He denied any involvement, even as the officers pointed out that he was the one person who would have had access to her food and daily routine. But there was no direct evidence linking him to the poisoning, and he appeared to be the picture of a worried husband. But something wasn't adding up. Eleanor's health had deteriorated too slowly for anyone to have noticed the signs earlier, and the fact that she had been suffering from such vague and non-specific symptoms for so long made it clear that her condition wasn't the result of a random illness or disease. It was a slow, methodical process, one that had been carefully orchestrated by someone who understood how to cover their tracks. The police continued to dig deeper into the couple's life, analyzing their financial records, any history of conflict, and even looking at their past behavior. They uncovered unsettling details. Eleanor had a significant life insurance policy, one that would pay out a substantial sum if she died. In fact, the payout would be large enough to provide Thomas with the kind of financial security that would allow him to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The investigators also learned that Thomas had been the one to manage the couple's finances and was responsible for all of their major decisions. It became clear that while he had appeared to be a loving and dedicated husband, his actions might have been motivated by something far darker. As the authorities started to piece together the puzzle, the pieces fell into place. Eleanor's slow and steady decline was no accident. Thomas had been poisoning her for months, if not years. It was a carefully planned crime that relied on Eleanor's gradual worsening health and the medical community's inability to identify the source of her symptoms. It wasn't until she collapsed in that kitchen, unable to fight any longer, that the truth began to surface. But by then it was almost too late for Elena to realize the horror of what had been happening to her all along. And as for Thomas, the evidence began to stack up. It wasn't just his lack of emotional reaction or the fact that he had access to the poison. It was the small, seemingly insignificant details that revealed his plan. The poison was slow-acting, just enough to cause Eleanor's symptoms to worsen over time, but not enough to immediately raise suspicion. By the time doctors figured out what had happened, it was clear Thomas Gregory, the loving doctor, had methodically and deliberately killed his wife. But now the question was no longer how, rather it was when he would be held accountable for his actions. As the investigation into Elena's death deepened, the authorities began to uncover more chilling details that painted a picture of premeditation and cold calculation. The toxic substance found in Elena's system was a rare poison, one that was typically used in small doses to cause gradual internal damage. It wasn't something you could just stumble upon, and its effects were so subtle that it would have taken months, even years, for someone to recognize the pattern of poisoning. That was exactly what Thomas had done. His medical knowledge made him the perfect person to orchestrate such a crime, using his expertise to avoid detection while slowly dismantling his wife's health. As investigators combed through the couple's life, they discovered an unsettling pattern. Thomas had not only been Elena's primary caregiver, but also the person who controlled every aspect of her medical care. He had been the one accompanying her to every doctor's visit, always ready with suggestions for further tests or potential diagnoses. It was clear now that he had been guiding her treatment, or lack of it, while deliberately keeping her symptoms vague enough to avoid suspicion. He was her protector, her doctor, her husband, all while secretly plotting her death. The authorities also uncovered financial records that raised red flags. Elena's life insurance policy had a large payout, one that would significantly benefit Thomas in the event of her death. It was a cold, calculated move. Thomas had been well aware of the financial security he stood to gain from Elena's death, and as her health continued to decline, his greed grew. His actions were no longer just about controlling her life and managing her health. They were about securing a future that had nothing to do with her. But the most damning evidence came when detectives uncovered a chilling letter that Thomas had written weeks before Eleanor's collapse. It was a confession hidden among personal documents in a locked drawer. The letter was a striking, almost casual admission of guilt, in which Thomas laid out exactly what he had been doing. He explained how he had been poisoning Elena over the past 2 years, detailing the small, deliberate doses that had caused her slow, agonizing decline. It was clear from the letter that his actions had been premeditated, planned down to the smallest detail. He even wrote that he had hoped the slow nature of the poisoning would prevent anyone from catching on, allowing him to collect the insurance money without suspicion. When this letter was found, the case against Thomas became undeniable. He was arrested and charged with murder, the evidence against him overwhelming. His initial denial of any wrongdoing quickly crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The confession letter, combined with the toxic substance found in Elena's System and the financial motive painted a clear picture of the man he had become, a predator, in the guise of a loving husband. In court, Thomas attempted to maintain his innocence, insisting that he had done everything in his power to help his wife. But the facts were indisputable. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a guilty verdict. Thomas Gregory, the respected doctor who had once been admired by everyone, was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his wife. Elena's family was left to mourn her loss, knowing that her death had been the result of a betrayal so deep that it was hard to comprehend. The life she had built with Thomas, the man she trusted above all others, had been nothing more than a facade. In the end, Eleanor's death was not just a tragedy of a life lost too soon. It was the tragedy of a woman who had been deceived, manipulated, and slowly poisoned by the one person she should have been able to trust most. For Thomas, the consequences of his actions were just beginning. The life he had carefully constructed, the respected doctor, the loving husband, crumbled in an instant. His future, once bright and promising, was now a prison sentence for a crime that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And as for Elena, the world would never forget the beautiful, vibrant woman whose life had been stolen by someone she had loved and trusted.